During my research on this video and the 2 other videos I made about conspiracy theories, I went through a lot of literature about the subject. Most of the sources I reviewed can be very simplified, summarized under one of the following 2 types of theoretical approaches. Either A, trying to explain why people believe in conspiracy theories and criticizing that, or B, saying it makes perfect sense why people believe in conspiracy theories and criticizing the stigmatization of those people. I've talked plenty about both of these theoretical approaches in my other 2 videos about the subject, so check those out if you want to know more about it. For today's video, I wanted to go deeper into the subject though, and hopefully get to a more comprehensive understanding of it. To achieve that, it was important for me that I keep both theoretical strains in mind, by A, not losing sight of trying to really empathize with the social situation of the conspiracy theorists, while B, not losing sight of the political and ideological dangers of conspiracy theories. The following video, therefore, is an approach to understand the emergence of conspiracy theories as a sign of a social crisis that is produced by certain social dynamics that are set into the structural conditions of society. In other words, the way certain capitalist dynamics inherently operate causes the emergence of conspiracy theories. An important thing to note here is that I will primarily focus on what I identified as conspiracy beliefs or ideologies in the previous videos. Such beliefs are defined by A, interconnected narratives in which all public events are related, B, the implication that all public events are the direct results of human intent, C, the clear definition of an enemy group, usually personified by rather an ethnic or an influential group such as politicians. And lastly, D, a high degree of skepticism towards public events, where any external evidence against the conspiracy belief will rather be dismissed or interpreted in favor of the belief. Therefore, the following examinations don't deny the fact that real conspiracies exist. But now that we've got that out of the way, let's start with the video. When I was reading about conspiracy theories, I was often wondering how the social and emotional experience of the people that believe in these theories looks like. I found many different, often very interesting answers to this question, but many which left me kind of unsatisfied. Let me explain this. In his essay, Off Conspiracy Theories, American philosopher Brian Keeley introduces the notion of pervasive skepticism to identify the core psychological pattern of conspiracy believers. An attitude of pervasive skepticism is defined by the fact that any external evidence against the belief of the pervasive skepticist will be interpreted as evidence in support of given belief. That means that the pervasive skepticist won't accept any contrary evidence that goes against their basic belief that a conspiracy is unfolding. In fact, everything that goes against the belief will rather be ignored or seen as part of the conspiracy. In a similar direction goes the approach of American historian Richard Hofstadter, who identified a paranoid thinking style that is defined by the feeling of persecution that believers share as the root cause for believing in conspiracy theories. According to Hofstadter, conspiracy theorists construct the picture of massive plots that are being carried out by a clear enemy group, which is dehumanized as an almost demonic force that controls everything. While I found these conceptions by Keeley and Hofstadter really helpful in regards to understanding and criticizing conspiracy theories, and also understanding their inherently ideological character, they also left me wondering how such a mental attitude can develop, and what social circumstances could lead up to that. What are the emotional reasons that drive someone to such a degree of mistrust towards public events, where basically nothing could change that attitude? I then found the essay Anxiety and Politics by famous social philosopher and third-generation critical theorist Axel Honneth. His essay is a review of another essay with the same name by political scientist Franz Neumann, in which he connects the possibility of the democratic participation of the members of a society to their degree of autonomy. An individual that isn't autonomous, therefore, is not capable of freely appropriating the societal practice of democratic contribution as a rational equivalent. Now, the core concept that Honneth sees within Neumann's approach is that anxiety can undermine the cognitive capabilities of humans, hence disrupting the possibility of autonomous societal participation. the type of anxiety Honneth talks about here is of a pathological character, in that it paralyzes the individual, preventing the possibility of what Honneth calls social freedom in his more recent works. Social freedom is the capability of individuals to freely self-realize their own goals in accordance with the goals of a given community, without being obstructed by inner obstacles or constraints. Accordingly, the will of a person that is free in Honneth's definition is complementary to the goals of their social community, meaning that the community can be seen as an objectification of the will of that individual. Honneth writes, "Lack of coercion and freedom cannot be understood simply as the absence of external force or influence, but must rather signify the lack of inner barriers as well as psychological inhibitions and fears. But this second form of freedom is to be understood, to put it positively, as a form of trust directed inward, which gives individuals basic confidence in both the articulation of their needs and the exercise of their abilities." Honneth now says that anxiety is something that can obstruct the possibility of being free in the sense of the word, which as a result can prevent the possibility to freely participate within social contexts. Social interactions will be determined by fear and anxiety as a result. He writes that it is the early childhood years of socialization that set the base ground for the way in which someone will later perceive their environment when they're adults. Children that experience their social environment as a trustworthy social atmosphere, for example, will most likely develop a basic trust towards their social environment when they're adults. Children, on the other hand, that perceive their early social environment as uncertain and uncontrollable, or that experience their early social bonds as fragile, will carry over this basic experience into their adulthood. Now, interestingly, it is the children living under more economically uncertain conditions that will be more likely to have such early childhood experiences of uncertainty and instability, leading them to later perceive the society around them as hostile and not trustworthy. But how is this related to conspiracy theories? Well, in a 1994 study about the social situation of people that believe in conspiracy theories, sociologist Ted Goertzel found correlations of people that believe in conspiracy theories with social alienation, insecurity about employment, being part of a minority group, and lack of interpersonal trust. That means that people that live under circumstances of social uncertainty will be more likely to also believe in conspiracy theories. As we've just seen, children that are socialized under uncertain circumstances can develop a mistrust towards their social environment, which leads them to perceive their social environment as hostile in their adult years. Now, wouldn't this be a very sensible motive for someone to develop thinking patterns such as those that Keeley identified as pervasive skepticism, or Hofstadter described as the paranoid style? This leads us back to the theoretical model that critical theorist Adorno and members of the Frankfurt School developed, coined by the term the Authoritarian personality that I already talked about in the first video. It states that such authoritarian personalities develop needs within the early years of socialization that make them more susceptible towards fascist ideologies. The authoritarian personality perceives the world as a dangerous place and yearns for controlled structures, enemy stereotypes, and authority. Honneth similarly speaks of the lacking possibility of children that grow up under uncertain and hostile environments and never learn to perceive their social environment as trustworthy. With these findings, we can also make more sense of Hofstadter's idea of the paranoid style. The personality of this type of conspiracy theorist is defined by the experience of mistrust and a lack of control. Foreigners or politicians that are often identified as the enemy within conspiracy narratives consequently can be representations of strange, alien, incomprehensible forces and therefore are very suitable as projections of the anxious mistrust and perceived lack of control that defines this personality type. In her study about alienation, German social philosopher Rahel Jeggi, amongst other things, speaks about the possibilities and limitations of individuals to form different interpretations about their situations and be autonomous. Her definition of autonomy strongly resembles Honneth's definition of social freedom we've talked about before, by the way. Now, according to Jeggi, to be autonomous, individuals need to be capable of appropriating the social situations they find themselves in. Similarly to Honneth's conception of social freedom, individuals can feel constrained and obstructed within certain social contexts. Influenced by Charles Taylor's conception of self-interpreting animals, Yegi now says that the capability of rather feeling constrained or free within social situations depends on the possibilities we have to interpret our situations and articulate ourselves within them. Articulation here, by the way, doesn't refer to the capability of formulating something, but rather the capability to mentally comprehend something. I've already dealt with this subject in my video about social roles, so if you're interested in it, you can watch that video. Yegi now writes how our self-accessibility, which is the possibility of interpreting a situation without inner constraints, determines the possibilities we have to see our situation as a situation in which we have agency and therefore be autonomous in a social sense. With that in mind, we can now look at anxiety as an emotion that can obstruct this possibility, and by that limit the possibilities of interpreting the social situations we find ourselves in. Yegi identifies this as the subjective possibility to interpret a situation as a situation in which we have agency. Let me simplify this a little bit. If I feel anxious or tense and a friend makes a joke that usually would make me laugh, I might interpret that joke as something threatening or as an insult. Now, if I'm socialized under circumstances in which I perceive my social environment as genuinely threatening, this might become something that is essential to my personality, and therefore limiting my capabilities of interpreting things as non-threatening. But Yegi also speaks about objective possibilities that can limit such perceptions of situations. We could, for example, say that a social situation in which an individual is dealing with societal and institutional forces that derive from aspects such as social class limit the possibilities of interpreting situations. Certain class struggles, for example, are only known to people within certain economic situations. A single woman with a child, for example, with a low-income job, will experience struggles such as not being able to pay for a babysitter, which is something that a single woman with a high economical stability won't experience. Such objective struggles will automatically limit her capabilities to which she is able of interpreting things. That already starts with the fact that there is simply less time to think about certain things, and that even if there is time, the mental freedom to think will be obstructed by things such as the fact that there might be so many other things to worry about for someone that is dealing with certain class-related struggles. Since the subjective and objective capabilities of interpreting, understanding, and comprehending things are limited by such factors, narratives in which conspiracy theorists are stigmatized as intellectually inferior ultimately fall short in their explanatory persuasion. Instead, we should try and understand how collectives exposed to certain influences are led to perceive their social world as hostile, limiting their possibilities of trust towards society. I want to return to Honneth again for a moment to draw attention to another aspect. In his famous study, The Struggle for Recognition, Honneth shows how social collectives share certain experiences of disrespect in which they don't feel recognized. Recognition for Honneth involves experiences through which humans are interpersonally assured that they are safe, worthy, and respected. It is the assurance that the personal expectations that each individual has towards their social environment are met. Honneth draws from the theory of emotions of American philosopher John Dewey to develop his conception of recognition. According to Dewey, emotions have an intentional purpose within the involvement of social activities. They, for example, rather indicate a certain social resonance or a disappointment within contexts of different social expectations. Recognition now involves the satisfaction that comes with the assurance of certain emotional expectations. Honneth, on the other hand, calls the disappointment of these emotional expectations disrespect. He now writes how the disrespect that individuals experience holds the potential for social resistance and rebellion if there is a collective semantic through which these experiences can be explained. Honneth writes, "These expectations are internally linked to conditions for the formation of personal identity, and that they indicate the social patterns of recognition that allow subjects to know themselves to be both autonomous and individuated beings within their socio-cultural environment. If these normative expectations are disappointed by society, this generates precisely the type of moral experience expressed in cases where subjects feel disrespected. Hurt feelings of this sort can, however, become the motivational basis for collective resistance only if subjects are able to articulate them within an intersubjective framework of interpretation that they can show to be typical for an entire group. In this sense, the emergence of social movements hinges on the existence of a shared semantics that enables personal experiences of disappointment to be interpreted as something affecting not just the individual himself or herself, but also a circle of many other subjects. As long as there is no collective language through which experiences of disrespect can be understood as such, they are solely dealt with privately. There are certain similarities to these ideas within American philosopher Miranda Fricker's idea of a phenomenon she calls epistemic injustice, where the hermeneutical resources of collectives can be limited if interpretative conceptions for certain experienced injustices are lacking. Accordingly, conspiracy theorists would be collectives that experienced some sort of social disappointment or disrespect and that, due to their limited interpretative resources, can only make sense of their experiences within a collective semantic that is available for them. So is Hannett's conception maybe a way of making sense of social movements such as QAnon? Are individuals within social groups that follow such theories maybe socially disrespected as defined by Hannett? An interesting case study that can shed some light onto this is the sociological work Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild, in which she tries to understand why a big part of the American citizens is right-leaning and who support political parties that don't act in their favor. In her book, Hochschild introduces the notion of deep stories, which, according to Hochschild, represents an empathetic approach towards understanding the socio-emotional situation of individuals without passing judgment onto them. A deep story involves the emotional history and the reasons why someone feels how they feel, and therefore can make us empathize with how it feels to be a certain individual. Hochschild now finds that the deep stories within social groups that are part of the American red states all share certain similarities. She then says how these individuals came towards believing that at some point the American dream would become true for them when growing up, but how they find themselves in an experienced reality where this vision is constantly disappointed. Hochschild writes, on the one hand, the national ideal and promise at the brow of the hill was the American dream, which is to say progress. On the other hand, it had become hard to progress. The blame for this goes towards the line cutters, immigrants, black people, and so on. What I found particularly interesting here, though, was the fact that we have an exact representation of what Hannett is talking about when he speaks about the violation of recognition as a situation in which certain emotional expectations that individuals were socialized into are disappointed. The American dream was a narrative into which these people were socialized, and this narrative wasn't fulfilled in their experienced reality. But while this helps us to understand the emotional motives and the social situation of conspiracy theorists, we still have to acknowledge the fact that the grand conspiracy narratives, such as QAnon, are, well, false, and that conspiracy theories, due to their often racist and anti-Semitic narratives, pose an ideological danger. According to the findings of the previous chapter, conspiracy theories can be understood as an expression of social fear and disrespect towards certain groups of people. If feelings of disrespect and anxiety build the basic emotional attitude that conspiracy believers collectively share towards political and public institutions, and or if the interpretative resources are limited as such we have seen in the previous chapter, conspiracy theories would provide a narrative in which the perceived disrespect is acknowledged and made sense of through blame towards a responsible group of people. B, a narrative that is coherent with the perceived experience in which individuals see their social environment as hostile and not trustworthy. C, a narrative through which the experienced anxiety can be compensated. And lastly, D, a narrative that provides a coherent and holistic picture within limited hermeneutical resources and within the abstract social relations of capitalism. Therefore, maybe it is worth it to look at conspiracy theories as less of something that is just irrational, and instead understanding them as theories about the world that particularly serve the purpose of making rational sense of the world. Accordingly, conspiracy theories would be critical approaches of individuals to understand the world in accordance to the way that they have experienced it. From this perspective, conspiracy theories can be understood as a form of critique in which individuals try to understand and denounce the injustice and the contradictions of a system that harms them. Unfortunately, though, the content of this critique is misguided and false. Moreover, conspiracy theories can be explanations that try to make sense of contradictory and incomprehensible conditions. From this point of view, it is the experience of the abstractness of the social conditions of capitalism that require an explanatory model that can symbolize this abstract appearance of capitalism. Canadian philosopher Moïse Postone used a Marxist vocabulary to show how the Jew within anti-Semitic conspiracy theories was the ideal personification of the abstractness of the social relations of capitalism. The Jew was not just a representation of capital and money, but of capitalism as a whole in its abstract entirety. The vague and transcendent way that capitalism appeared in the form of financial capital as something alien and abstract was personified by the Jews. Therefore, any dissatisfaction or suffering people experienced related to capitalism was pushed on the Jews as a result. In this context, we can understand conspiracy theories as a type of misguided capitalism critique, in which the root cause for some kind of social suffering is misinterpreted or misunderstood. This false critique emerges from certain emotional motivations that result from a disappointment of social expectations and/or from a class-based social distrust, and is limited by certain class-related subjective and objective hermeneutical or interpretative resources that determine the ways in which social phenomenon can be understood. Moreover, conspiracy theories might also be a more accessible form of capitalism critique. Due to their moral simplicity of good against evil that always makes clear who is responsible, they represent a theoretical tool that most people can easily comprehend without, for example, understanding the complex dynamics of the capitalist economy. The findings I have just presented can lead us to an interesting conclusion. Certain societal dynamics necessarily lead up to the formation of conspiracy theories. That means that conspiracy theories can be seen as a crisis of capitalism, as such that they are systemically written into the capitalist DNA in its current state. If certain social groups perceive their social environment as disrespectful or suspicious as a result of their social status, and if the same groups have limited resources to understand their social situation, the conflict is integral to the system that creates it. If the emergence of conspiracy theories is symptomatic within capitalism, this misguided critique of capitalism becomes a critique of capitalism by itself. In other words, if we don't want conspiracy theories to emerge because they are dangerous or a threat to democracy, we need to criticize those aspects of capitalism that create them. If we want to prevent the political alienation we've been talking about, each individual within a democratic society needs to be capable of autonomous participation within it. As Honneth writes, democratic will formation presupposes a necessary measure of individual autonomy. The readiness to develop social anxiety could be remedied by the possibility of guaranteeing conditions of socialization that afford a great degree of reliability and security in intersubjective relationships.